The Texas plains stretched endlessly beneath a steel-gray sky, their usual golden grass now buried under 2 feet of pristine snow that crunched beneath Sarah Mitchell's stumbling feet. Each labored breath escaped her lips in sharp white puffs that vanished instantly in the bitter February wind of 1875. The temperature had plummeted to what felt like 20 below zero, and the storm showed no mercy. She clutched her 3-month-old son closer to her chest, feeling his tiny body trembling beneath the thin woolen blanket she'd wrapped around him before fleeing their burning homestead. Little Thomas had stopped crying an hour ago, which terrified her more than his earlier wails. His silence meant he was growing weak, his small lungs struggling against the frigid air. "Stay with me, baby," she whispered against his downy head, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "We're going to make it, we have to." But even as the words left her lips, Sarah knew she was lying to herself. Her legs felt like lead weights and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. The woolen dress that had seemed adequate that morning now felt as useless as paper against the relentless cold. Ice crystals had formed in her dark hair, and she could no longer feel her fingers or toes. Behind them, somewhere in the white void, lay the smoldering remains of everything she'd called home. The Kiowa raiding party had struck at dawn, their war cries cutting through the morning calm like knives. She'd watched from the root cellar where she'd hidden with Thomas as they burned the cabin, killed their livestock, and rode off with anything of value. Her husband, Daniel, had been away, riding the winter lines with the other ranchers. She prayed he was still alive somewhere out there. The wind picked up, driving snow into her face with stinging force. Sarah stumbled, catching herself just before falling face first into a drift. The baby stirred weakly in her arms, and she forced herself to keep moving. Stop moving, and they would both die out here. The nearest settlement was Fort Griffin, but that was at least 15 miles through this wilderness, and she'd already been walking for hours. Her feet were numb now, and she could barely tell if she was still following what she hoped was an old cattle trail. The landscape looked the same in every direction, endless white punctuated by the dark skeletons of mesquite and oak trees. The snow continued to fall, heavy and thick, obscuring her vision to mere yards ahead. "Please, God," she prayed aloud, her voice cracking. "Don't let my baby die out here. Take me if you must, but spare him." As if in answer to her plea, the wind suddenly died down, and through the falling snow, she glimpsed something ahead. A dark shape that didn't match the natural curves of the terrain. Sarah squinted, wiping snow from her eyelashes. It looked like rocks, a formation of some kind. With renewed hope, she pushed forward, each step an agony that shot up through her frozen legs. As she drew closer, she realized it was indeed a rocky outcropping, carved by years of wind and weather into a series of natural shelters. Not perfect, but it would break the wind and maybe give them a chance to rest. She practically fell into the largest crevice, gasping with relief as the howling wind suddenly muted to a whisper. The rocky walls rose around them like protective arms, and for the first time in hours, she wasn't being pelted by snow and ice. Sarah sank down against the stone wall, cradling Thomas in her lap. His little face was pale, almost blue around the lips, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. She opened her dress and pulled him against her skin, hoping her body heat might warm him. But she realized with growing horror that she had little warmth left to give. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Mama tried. I tried so hard." The baby's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they seemed to focus on her face. He made a small sound, not quite a cry but a weak mewling that broke her heart. Then his eyes closed again and his breathing became even shallower. Sarah felt despair wash over her like a physical weight. They were going to die here, in this lonely place, and no one would ever find them. Come spring, some cowboy might stumble across their bones, but by then it would be too late for prayers or regrets. She closed her own eyes and tried to remember better times. The day Daniel had proposed, right here on these same plains when they were green with spring grass. Their wedding in the little church in Fort Worth. The joy she'd felt when she realized she was carrying Thomas. All of it seemed like a lifetime ago now, like memories from someone else's life. The wind outside grew stronger, and she could hear it whistling through the rocks above them. Snow began to drift into their shelter, and Sarah realized that even this small refuge might not be enough. The storm was getting worse, not better, and she had no fire, no food, no way to keep them warm through the night that was fast approaching. She must have dozed because suddenly she was startled awake by a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A soft scraping, like leather against stone. Sarah's eyes flew open and her heart stopped. Standing at the entrance to their rocky shelter was a figure that seemed to emerge from the storm itself. Tall and silent, wrapped in heavy buffalo robes and buckskin, with long black hair whipping in the wind. The dying light caught the copper tones of his skin and the sharp angles of his face. A Comanche warrior, she realized, with a mixture of terror and strange relief. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in the scene before him. A white woman and baby, obviously dying of cold and exposure. Sarah waited for him to turn and leave them to their fate, or worse. Everyone knew the Comanche showed no mercy to white settlers. Instead, he stepped into the shelter. The warrior moved with fluid grace despite his size, settling into a crouch just inside the rocky opening. Up close, Sarah could see he was younger than she'd first thought. Perhaps in his late 20s, with a face marked by the harsh lines of someone who'd lived his entire life on these unforgiving plains. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, stark white against his bronze skin. He studied them without speaking, his expression unreadable. Sarah found herself holding her breath, Thomas's small body still pressed against her chest. She'd heard countless stories about Comanche warriors, their fierceness in battle, their raids on settlements, the fear they struck in the hearts of every frontier family. Yet this man's presence didn't feel threatening. If anything, there was something, almost careful in the way he observed them. Without warning, he reached into his robes and pulled out a small leather pouch. Sarah flinched instinctively, but he made no aggressive moves. Instead, he opened the pouch and withdrew what looked like dried meat. He tore off a small piece and held it out to her. I don't understand, Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. From the cold, the warrior's eyes flicked to the baby, then back to her face. He pushed the food closer to her, and she realized he was trying to help. With trembling fingers, she accepted the jerky, grateful beyond words for the salty, smoky taste that filled her mouth. It was the first food she'd had since before dawn. While she chewed, the man began moving around their small shelter with practiced efficiency. He gathered dried grass and small twigs from crevices in the rocks where they'd been protected from the snow. Within minutes, he had a small fire crackling in the center of their space, the smoke finding its way out through gaps in the stone above. The warmth was immediate and blessed. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, not from cold this time, but from gratitude. Thomas stirred in her arms, his breathing seeming to strengthen already in the warmer air. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know why you're helping us, but thank you." The warrior's eyes met hers briefly, and she saw something there she hadn't expected, a deep sadness that seemed to echo her own grief. He looked away quickly and busied himself arranging their meager supplies. As the fire grew stronger, chasing away the deadly chill, Sarah found herself studying her unlikely savior. His movements were economical and precise, every action serving a purpose. He'd fashioned a windbreak from his buffalo robe, blocking the worst of the storm from their entrance. The smell of wood smoke and the dancing flames created an almost cozy atmosphere that felt surreal after hours of believing she and Thomas would die. "My name is Sarah," she said softly, hoping to break the silence. "Sarah Mitchell, this is my son Thomas." The warrior glanced at her but didn't respond. She wondered if he understood English or if he simply chose not to speak. Either way, his actions spoke louder than words could have. He produced another pouch, this one containing what looked like crushed berries mixed with fat. He scooped some onto his finger and held it toward her mouth. Sarah hesitated, trusting food from a stranger went against every instinct. But Thomas's weak cries made the decision for her. She needed to eat to keep her strength up for nursing. The mixture was surprisingly sweet and energizing. She could feel her body responding to the nutrition, warmth returning to her limbs as she sat closer to the fire. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "I mean, how did you find us?" This time, the warrior did speak, his voice low and gravelly, from disuse. "Saw smoke from your burning lodge. Followed tracks." His English was accented but clear, and Sarah realized he'd probably learned it from traders or other interactions with white settlements. The fact that he'd followed her trail meant he'd been tracking her for hours through the storm. You saw our cabin burn?" Sarah's heart clenched as she thought of everything they'd lost. He nodded once, his expression grim. "Kiowa war party. Saw them right away." "Are you?" She paused, unsure how to ask without seeming rude. "Are you with them?" Something that might have been surprise flickered across his features. "Comanche," he said simply, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. She knew enough about tribal politics to understand that Comanche and Kiowa, while sometimes allied, were distinct peoples with their own territories and conflicts. "Why are you helping us?" The question tumbled out before she could stop herself. The warrior was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible above the crackling fire. "Lost my own wife. And child to soldiers 2 winters past. Know the sound of grief." Sarah's heart constricted. She looked at this man, this supposed enemy, with new understanding. They were both survivors, both carrying wounds that might never fully heal. In that moment, the color of their skin and the differences in their cultures seemed insignificant compared to the shared language of loss. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He met her eyes again, and this time he held her gaze. "Storm will pass by morning. Cannot travel in this." Sarah nodded, understanding. They would spend the night here together, this unlikely pair thrown together by circumstance and tragedy. She looked down at Thomas, who seemed to be breathing easier now in the warmth of the fire. His color was better, and he'd even managed to nurse a little when she'd tried earlier. The warrior began spreading out another buffalo robe on the ground near the fire. He gestured for her to move closer to the warmth, then took a position near the entrance where he could watch for any threats. Sarah realized he intended to stay awake all night, standing guard over her and Thomas. "What's your name?" she asked as she settled onto the soft fur with her baby. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer this question either. Finally, he spoke a word in his own language that sounded like flowing water over stones. "I can't pronounce that," Sarah admitted with a small, sad smile. "White men call me Grey Wolf," he said after a moment. "Grey Wolf." She repeated the name, testing how it felt. "That's a strong name." He didn't respond, but she thought she saw the ghost of something. Not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes. Outside their shelter, the storm raged on, but inside, Sarah felt safer than she had in months. It seemed impossible that this man, who by all accounts should be her enemy, had become her protector instead. She closed her eyes and listened to the comforting sounds of the fire and Grey Wolf's steady breathing. For the first time since dawn, she allowed herself to believe they might actually survive. Dawn broke clear and bitter cold, the storm having finally exhausted itself during the night. Sarah woke to find Grey Wolf already moving about their small shelter, banking the fire and preparing for travel. Thomas was sleeping peacefully against her chest, his color much improved after a night of warmth and several successful feedings. "Storm has passed," Grey Wolf said without looking at her. "Must move soon. More weather coming." Sarah sat up carefully, her body stiff from sleeping on the ground despite the buffalo robe. Through the shelter opening, she could see a world transformed. Snow drifted 6 feet high in places, creating an alien landscape of white hills and valleys. The sun glittered off the surface like scattered diamonds, beautiful but deadly. "Where will we go?" she asked, dreading the answer. Fort Griffin still seemed impossibly far, especially with a baby. Grey Wolf was quiet as he packed his few belongings, with methodical precision. "My camp, 2 miles north. Safe there. Sarah felt her stomach drop. A Comanche camp meant more warriors, more unknowns. What if they weren't as tolerant as Grey Wolf? What if bringing a white woman and child into their midst caused problems for him? I'm not sure that's wise, she said carefully. Your people and mine, we don't. You die if you go to Fort, Grey Wolf interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact. Too far, too cold, baby too small. Sarah looked down at Thomas, knowing he was right. The baby had barely survived one night of exposure. Another day traveling through deep snow and sub-zero temperatures would certainly kill him. Will they accept us? She asked quietly. Grey Wolf finally turned to look at her directly. My grandmother leads women. She will decide. The way he said it suggested this grandmother held considerable power in their community. Sarah had heard that Comanche women often wielded significant influence, unlike in white society where women were expected to be seen and not heard. And if she decides against us? Then you leave when weather clears. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah heard something in his voice. A quiet determination that suggested he wouldn't let harm come to them regardless of his grandmother's decision. They ate a small breakfast of the dried meat and berry mixture, sharing water that Grey Wolf had melted from snow. Sarah was amazed at how efficiently he'd managed to keep them alive through the night with so few resources. It spoke to a lifetime of survival skills that her homesteader existence had never required. When they were ready to leave, Grey Wolf fashioned a crude sling from part of his buffalo robe, allowing Sarah to carry Thomas close to her body while keeping her hands free for balance. He broke trail ahead of her, his snowshoes allowing him to walk on top of the drifts while she struggled through knee-deep snow behind him. The journey to his camp was the hardest 2 miles Sarah had ever traveled. Every step was a battle against the snow, the cold, and her own exhaustion. But Grey Wolf was patient, stopping frequently to let her rest and ensuring she had water and small bites of food to keep her strength up. As they crested a small hill, Sarah saw smoke rising from a grove of cottonwoods in the valley below. The Comanche winter camp was larger than she'd expected. Perhaps 30 lodges arranged in a rough circle, their buffalo hide walls dark against the snow. People moved between the structures, and she could see horses in a makeshift corral sheltered by the trees. Remember, Grey Wolf said quietly as they began their descent. Show no fear. Weakness invites challenge. Sarah nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the camp would hear it. She'd never been this close to a Comanche village, never imagined she'd be walking into one as a guest rather than a captive. The first person to notice their approach was a young boy who'd been playing in the snow near the edge of camp. He took one look at Sarah and ran toward the lodges, shouting in the Comanche language. Within moments, people began emerging from their warm homes, gathering to stare at the extraordinary sight of Grey Wolf, returning with a white woman and baby. Sarah kept her eyes forward and her chin up, remembering his advice about showing no fear. But inside, she was terrified. These were the people her own kind had demonized, fought against, feared above all others on the frontier. Now she was walking among them, dependent on their mercy for her life and her child's life. An older woman emerged from one of the larger lodges near the center of camp. She was small but carried herself with unmistakable authority. Her gray hair was braided with beads and feathers, and her weathered face bore the marks of someone who'd seen many seasons. Sarah instinctively knew this must be Grey Wolf's grandmother. The woman approached them with measured steps, her dark eyes taking in every detail of Sarah and the baby. When she was close enough to touch, she stopped and spoke rapidly to Grey Wolf in their language. He responded in the same tongue, his voice respectful but firm. Sarah caught her own name and Thomas's in the exchange, along with words that might have referred to the storm and their situation. The grandmother's expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. Finally, the older woman stepped closer to Sarah and reached out toward Thomas. For a moment, Sarah's instincts screamed at her to pull away, to protect her child. But Grey Wolf's steady presence beside her gave her strength. She carefully adjusted Thomas so the grandmother could see him better. The baby chose that moment to wake up and look directly at the weathered face studying him. His blue eyes were bright and alert in the cold morning air, To Sarah's amazement, he smiled, that first real smile babies develop around 3 months old. Something shifted in the grandmother's expression. The stern mask softened and she made a soft cooing sound that transcended language barriers. She looked up at Sarah with what might have been approval, then spoke to Grey Wolf again. She says the baby has a strong spirit. Grey Wolf translated, that he shows no fear of new faces. And what does that mean for us? Sarah asked quietly. Grey Wolf exchanged a few more words with his grandmother before turning back to Sarah. You may stay until spring. You will work with the women, learn our ways. The baby will be safe. Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. She looked at the grandmother and bowed her head respectfully. Thank you. I don't know how to repay such kindness. The older woman seemed to understand the gesture, if not the words. She turned and walked toward one of the smaller lodges, gesturing for them to follow. Grey Wolf gathered Sarah's few belongings and guided her after his grandmother. The lodge was warm and comfortable, furnished with buffalo robes and simple but functional items. A small fire burned in the center, with a smoke hole overhead to carry away the smoke. It was cramped compared to her cabin, but after nearly freezing to death in the snow, it felt like a palace. The grandmother spoke to Grey Wolf again, her tone instructional. He nodded and turned to Sarah. She says you will stay here. Women will teach you what you need to know. I will... He paused, searching for words. I will speak for you if there are problems. Sarah understood the significance of that promise. In taking responsibility for her welfare, Grey Wolf was putting his own standing in the tribe at risk. If she caused trouble or failed to fit in, the consequences would fall on him as well. Why? She asked for the second time since he'd found them. Why are you doing this for us? Grey Wolf's scarred face was thoughtful as he considered his answer. When he spoke, his words were careful and precise. In my vision quest, I saw a white bird carrying a small one through a storm. Medicine Man said it meant I would save life to balance lives lost. Maybe this is what was meant. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. In her world, visions and medicine men were dismissed as superstition. But standing here in this warm lodge, holding her healthy baby after nearly dying in the snow, she found herself believing in possibilities she'd never considered before. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Grey Wolf nodded once and turned to leave. At the entrance, he paused and looked back. Your husband. If he lives, he will search for you. When spring comes, choice will be yours to make. With that, he was gone, leaving Sarah alone in her new world with only her sleeping son and the promise of sanctuary until the snows melted. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp going about their daily business. Children playing, women calling to each other, the normal rhythms of life continuing, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her here. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival in the Comanche camp, and the rhythm of daily life had begun to feel almost natural. She'd learned to braid her hair in the practical style favored by the women, to cook over an open fire without burning their simple meals, and to understand basic words in the Comanche language. Thomas thrived in the warm lodge, growing plumper and more alert each day. The grandmother, whose name was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, had taken a particular interest in teaching Sarah their ways. Despite the language barrier, they'd developed a system of gestures and simple words that allowed them to communicate effectively. Ayana's daughter, a woman named Dakota, had become Sarah's closest friend among the women, helping her navigate the complex social dynamics of camp life. But it was Grey Wolf who occupied most of Sarah's thoughts, though she tried to deny it, even to herself. He visited their lodge each evening, ostensibly to check on their welfare and translate when needed. But Sarah had begun to notice the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, the careful way he positioned himself between her and any potential threats, the small gifts he brought, a rabbit he'd snared, a warm pair of moccasins in her size, extra blankets when the nights grew particularly cold. This morning, Sarah was helping Dakota prepare hides for tanning when a commotion arose at the edge of camp. Riders were approaching. White men from the sound of their horses and the shouts in English that carried on the wind. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She recognized one of the voices. "Daniel," she whispered, gathering Thomas closer to her chest. Grey Wolf appeared at her side as if summoned by her fear. His hand rested on the knife at his belt and his expression had gone cold and dangerous. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. This was the moment she'd known would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it so soon. Daniel had found her just as Grey Wolf had predicted. But what would happen now? A small group of riders entered the camp under a white flag of truce, their horses dancing nervously in the snow. Daniel Mitchell sat his horse with the rigid posture Sarah remembered, flanked by 4 other men she recognized as neighbors and fellow ranchers. Their weapons were visible but not drawn, a tense neutrality that could explode into violence at any moment. Ayanna emerged from her lodge with the bearing of a queen, flanked by several of the camp's warriors. Grey Wolf moved to join them, but not before speaking quietly to Sarah. "Stay in lodge. No matter what happens, stay hidden until this is finished." But Sarah knew she couldn't hide. This confrontation was about her, and she wouldn't let others face danger on her behalf. She wrapped Thomas in his warmest blankets and stepped outside, feeling the weight of every eye in camp upon her. Daniel's face went through a series of emotions when he saw her: relief, anger, confusion, and something else she couldn't identify. His gaze took in her Comanche-style clothing, her braided hair, the easy way she moved among the people who'd become her protectors. "Sarah," he called out, his voice strained. "Thank God you're alive. We've been searching for weeks." She walked slowly toward the center of camp, very aware of Grey Wolf matching her pace just behind her left shoulder. When she was close enough to speak normally, she stopped. "Hello, Daniel." Her husband's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, more fully. His gaze lingered on Grey Wolf with undisguised hostility. "What's this about, Sarah? Why haven't you tried to escape? Have they been holding you prisoner?" Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything she said now would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the safety of everyone in this camp. If Daniel believed she was being held against her will, he might convince himself he needed to rescue her with violence. "They saved our lives," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the snowy ground. "Thomas and I would have died in the storm if not for their help." "Their help?" Daniel's voice rose incredulously. "Sarah, these are savages. They burned our home, killed our livestock." "That was a Kiowa war party," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "These are Comanche people. They took us in when we had nothing, cared for our son when he was dying of cold." Daniel's face reddened with anger and embarrassment at being corrected in front of his men. "I don't care what tribe they are. You're coming home with me. Now." The finality in his voice sparked something in Sarah she hadn't felt in years: rebellion. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd left her alone and defenseless while he rode off with his friends, a man who'd just assumed she'd be waiting for him to rescue her, grateful and compliant. "And if I choose not to come?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke from a pistol shot. Daniel's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, clearly never having considered that possibility. Behind him, his companions shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. "Choose not to come?" Daniel finally sputtered. "Sarah, you're my wife. You don't get to choose." Grey Wolf stepped forward then, his movement fluid and dangerous. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried easily in the cold air. "Woman chooses for herself here. Her choice to stay or go." Daniel's hand dropped to his gun butt. "I wasn't talking to you, savage." The insult rippled through the camp like a stone dropped in still water. Warriors tensed, and Sarah saw at least a dozen rifle barrels appear from behind lodges and trees. The situation was seconds away from exploding into bloodshed. "Enough!" Sarah's voice cracked like a whip, stopping everyone in their tracks. She stepped between the 2 men, one hand holding Thomas, the other raised in a gesture of peace. "I'll come with you," she said to Daniel, and felt Grey Wolf's sharp intake of breath behind her. But on my terms. Daniel relaxed slightly, thinking he'd won. What terms? We winter here until the snow's clear. Thomas is too young for that kind of travel in this weather, and I won't risk his life to satisfy your pride. My pride? Daniel's face darkened again. Sarah, people are talking. They're saying you're living like a squaw, that you've gone savage. Every day you stay here makes it worse. Sarah felt anger flare hot and bright in her chest. Talking? About what, Daniel? About how I kept our son alive when you weren't there? To help? About how I found people willing to share their food and shelter with strangers? About how my wife is living in sin with a Comanche buck? Daniel snarled, glaring at Grey Wolf. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger, not because it was true, but because Daniel would voice such a thing publicly. She was vaguely aware of Dakota translating for the women who didn't speak English, of the tension resetting even higher throughout the camp. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you imply such a thing?" But even as she denied it, Sarah felt her heart racing at the truth Daniel had unknowingly touched upon. She had grown close to Grey Wolf, closer than she'd admitted even to herself. The way he looked at her, the gentle care he showed Thomas, the quiet strength that made her feel safer than she'd felt in years. It had awakened something in her she'd thought was dead. Grey Wolf spoke then, his voice calm despite the insults. "I have touched no man's wife. I gave sanctuary to woman and child in need, as Creator commands." "The Creator?" Daniel laughed harshly. "You mean your heathen spirits?" "The same Creator you call God," Grey Wolf replied evenly. "Different names for same great spirit who teaches mercy." Sarah looked between the two men, her husband, rigid with righteousness and wounded pride, and the warrior who'd saved her life and asked for nothing in return. The contrast was stark and painful. "We'll leave in the spring," she said finally, "when it's safe for Thomas. Until then, we stay here." Daniel's jaw worked silently for a moment. He was clearly torn between his desire to drag her away immediately and the very real threat represented by the armed warriors surrounding them. Finally, pragmatism won out. "Spring," he agreed reluctantly. "But when the snows melt, you're coming home. Both of you." He wheeled his horse around and gestured to his men. As they prepared to leave, he looked back at Sarah one more time. "I hope you remember who you are, Sarah, and who you belong to." After the white men had ridden away, the camp slowly returned to normal activity. But Sarah remained standing in the center, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms, her mind churning, with the implications of what had just happened. Grey Wolf approached her carefully as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt. "You chose to go with him," he said simply. Sarah met his eyes, seeing the pain he was trying to hide. "I chose to keep Thomas safe, and to prevent bloodshed." "And when spring comes?" Sarah looked around the camp that had become her sanctuary, at the people who'd accepted her despite their differences, at the man who'd risked everything to save her. Then she looked down at her son, who would grow up in whatever world she chose for him. "When spring comes," she said quietly, "I'll face that choice when I have to." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew in her heart that the choice had already been made. The woman who would leave this camp in spring would not be the same one who'd stumbled into it half dead in a snowstorm. And the life she returned to, if she returned to it at all, would never be the same. Grey Wolf nodded once and turned to walk away, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Grey Wolf." He looked back, hope flickering in his dark eyes. "Thank you," she said, putting all the emotion she couldn't voice into those two simple words. "For everything." Understanding passed between them like a current, carrying promises and possibilities that neither dared speak aloud. When spring came, everything would change. But for now, in the space between winter and what came after, they had this moment, this choice, this hope that even the deepest differences might be bridged by the simple human need to love and be loved in return.